Brandon McMillan is a name that longtime fans of dog shows. Lucky Dog premiered since it started in 2013. Fans may remember that he left the series just after a few seasons and years of it.
Brandon McMillan walked away from Lucky Dog at the exact moment most people would have done anything to stay. The show was a hit. Millions of viewers knew his name, and his career was bigger than ever. Then, in 2020, he suddenly left. The question is, why would he walk away when everything seemed to be going right? This is the unsettling, untold truth behind Lucky Dog, and why its biggest star chose to burn his TV career to the ground. The Saturday morning show that changed everything. For years, Brandon McMillan was a familiar face on Saturday mornings. If you turned on the TV between 2013 and 2020, chances were you would find him standing in front of a dog that most people had already given up on. The dog might be terrified, aggressive, or completely out of control, but Brandon would walk in, stay calm, and start working with it. Before long, something interesting would happen. Little by little, the dog would begin to change. Millions of viewers watched those transformations every week, waiting to see if Brandon could somehow turn another difficult shelter dog around. His show, Lucky Dog, quickly became one of the most popular animal programs on television, and Brandon became much more than the man training the dogs. For many viewers, he was the reason they kept coming back. Now, Brandon wasn't exactly looking for easy cases. He went into shelters searching for dogs that had been abandoned, mistreated, or passed over because of their behavior. Some were afraid of people, some were aggressive, and others had spent so much time in shelters that finding them a home seemed almost impossible. Brandon would bring them back to his ranch in California and begin working with them. But there was one big problem. He didn't have months to figure everything out. In many cases, he had about 7 days. This 7-day window became one of the things that kept viewers watching. Every episode came with a simple question. Could Brandon change this dog's life before the time ran out? He wasn't just teaching commands. He was trying to understand what was behind the dog's behavior, earn its trust, and prepare it for a completely different life. Then came the part many viewers waited for most, the meeting with its new family. And those families often had stories of their own. Some were military veterans dealing with PTSD. Some had children with disabilities, while others were trying to rebuild their lives after difficult experiences. So when the dog finally arrived at its new home, it felt like more than an adoption. Viewers had watched where the dog started, followed the struggle, and then got to see where it ended up. That was what made Lucky Dog different from a simple dog training show. In less than half an hour, viewers could watch a frightened or difficult dog go from being overlooked in a shelter to becoming part of a family. The stories were emotional, easy to follow, and, most importantly, they gave people something to root for. Before long, Lucky Dog had become one of the biggest parts of CBS's Saturday morning lineup. For several years, everything seemed to be going Brandon's way. The show was successful, viewers loved him, and the man who had spent years working with difficult animals had become a television star. Then 2020 came, and something happened that left many of those viewers confused. Brandon left Lucky Dog during its 8th season, and there was no major goodbye. There was no final episode where he sat down and explained his decision to the audience. Instead, new hosts appeared. The show continued, and one of the most familiar faces on Saturday morning television was suddenly gone. Naturally, people wanted answers. What had happened? Had Brandon simply decided it was time to move on? Or was something else going on behind the scenes? With so little information available, different theories began circulating, and the silence only made people more curious. Because Brandon hadn't simply been another host who came and went. He had spent years building Lucky Dog, turning difficult rescue cases into some of the show's most memorable stories, and becoming the face viewers connected with every Saturday morning. So, if he had built something this successful, why would he suddenly walk away? But before we get to the shocking reason behind his exit, there's something about Brandon's past that makes his rise to television even more surprising, and it all began long before the cameras ever found him. The strange childhood that made Brandon McMillan. You see, most dog trainers learn their skills through courses, certifications, or years of working with regular family pets. But Brandon McMillan's story was nothing like that. He grew up in the circus, and from a very young age, he was surrounded by animals that most of us would be scared to stand anywhere near. His father and uncle were animal trainers, so lions, tigers, bears, and even reptiles were simply part of Brandon's childhood. While other kids were playing with their dogs at home, Brandon was learning how to work around animals that could seriously hurt someone if they were handled the wrong way. In fact, he has talked about cleaning up after tigers as one of the chores he had as a child. It might sound like a strange way to grow up, but those experiences gave Brandon something that would later become one of his biggest strengths as a trainer. He learned very early that before you can expect an animal to listen to you, you have to understand what it is trying to tell you. This meant paying attention to things most people would probably miss. The way an animal moved, where it was looking, how it held its body, or even a small movement of its tail could tell Brandon whether it was calm or getting ready to react. And when you are standing near a large predator, those little signs matter. So Brandon learned to stay calm, watch closely, and never ignore changes in an animal's behavior. Those lessons stayed with him as he grew older, and by the time he turned 18, he was ready to see where those skills could take him. It was this decision that eventually brought him to Los Angeles, where Brandon began working with animals for movies, television shows, and commercials. Over the years, he worked on more than 200 productions, which meant his job could look very different from one day to the next. If you have watched movies like The Hangover or We Bought a Zoo, there is a good chance you have seen some of the animals he helped train or handle. He also worked on shows like 24 and Jackass, but working with animals for television and movies was far more demanding than simply teaching a dog to sit.
TV and movies, but now he trains dogs for a much higher purpose. At Brandon's Lucky Dog Ranch, pups are trained to help diabetics, disabled veterans, and other clients who just need a little help from man's best friend.
The animals had to perform at precise moments amid cameras, lights, crew, and noise. Brandon learned not to force them, instead recognizing when they were comfortable, needed more time, or should stop. Years of experience taught him patience and how to read animals in difficult situations. Then, something else caught his attention. Around Los Angeles, animal shelters were filled with dogs that had been abandoned or given up because of their behavior. Some were scared, some were aggressive, and others were simply too difficult for people to handle. As a result, many of these dogs had very little chance of finding another home. However, Brandon didn't look at them as hopeless cases. After everything he had learned from working with wild animals, he understood that a dog acting aggressively didn't always mean it was a bad dog. Sometimes, the dog was simply scared, confused, or had never been given the right kind of training. So Brandon started working with some of these difficult shelter dogs and relied on the same basic lessons that had guided him throughout his life. He stayed calm, set clear boundaries, and gave the dogs time to adjust. Eventually, he bought a ranch in Southern California and began taking in dogs that other people had already given up on. At the same time, he became involved in training service dogs for disabled military veterans, giving him an even bigger reason to continue the work. And mind you, Brandon wasn't trying to become famous at this point. He wasn't thinking about television, building a brand, or wondering how many people might watch him. He was simply running his ranch, working with difficult dogs and trying to give them another chance. But then, one unexpected encounter brought television to his doorstep, and suddenly, the quiet life he had built around animals was about to change completely. The pressure behind Lucky Dog. In 2012, something happened that would completely change Brandon McMillan's life. Television producers came across him while he was working with a difficult rescue dog named Apollo, and they immediately noticed something different about the way he handled animals. Brandon wasn't trying to impress anyone or put on a show. He was simply doing what he had been doing for years, helping a dog that other people had already given up on. However, the producers saw something in that moment that they believed viewers would connect with, and before long, cameras would be coming to his ranch. Brandon probably didn't realize it at the time, but that meeting was about to take him from quietly training difficult dogs in Southern California to becoming one of the most familiar faces on Saturday morning television. A few months later, the ranch was no longer as quiet as it used to be. Production trucks were coming through the gates, cameras were being set up around the property, and a full television crew was following Brandon as he worked. Then, in the fall of 2013, Lucky Dog premiered on CBS, and viewers quickly became attached to the show. At first, Lucky Dog seemed simple. Brandon rescued dogs, trained them at the ranch, and matched them with families. Episodes lasted about 22 minutes, making the process appear quick and effortless. Viewers saw frightened shelter dogs become calm, happy pets, but rarely saw the challenges Brandon faced behind those heartwarming endings. Training a troubled dog is already difficult, especially when the animal has been neglected or has a history of aggression. Now add cameras moving around, bright lights shining, microphones hanging overhead, and people constantly walking in and out of the area. A frightened dog can react to something as small as a sudden movement or a loud noise, so Brandon had to pay attention to everything happening around him. Meanwhile, he still had to keep the production moving because there was always another scene waiting to be filmed. The pressure became even greater because Brandon couldn't simply work with each dog whenever he had the time. There were episodes to finish, filming dates to meet, and new dogs waiting for help. He had to visit shelters, find dogs that needed attention, bring them back to the ranch, train them, film their progress, and then find families that were right for them. At the same time, the ranch still had to run, so there was always another dog to care for, another scene to film, and another deadline getting closer. However, dogs don't understand television deadlines. If a dog needed more time to feel comfortable around people, Brandon couldn't simply tell it to hurry up because the cameras were ready. A dog that had spent months being afraid wasn't going to suddenly feel safe because the production schedule said it was time. Brandon had to keep the show moving without pushing the animals too far, and that wasn't always easy. Then there was the emotional side of the job, which viewers rarely got to see. Brandon wasn't just training dogs and finding them new homes. Some of the families featured on Lucky Dog were dealing with very difficult situations. There were military veterans living with PTSD, children with disabilities, and families trying to move forward after painful experiences. Brandon had to sit with these people, listen to their stories, understand what they needed, and then find a dog that could actually fit into their lives. That made each adoption much more important than simply finding a dog a nice home. There were real people depending on Brandon to make the right choice, and if the wrong dog was matched with the wrong family, it could create serious problems. So while viewers saw a happy ending at the end of each episode, Brandon had already spent days making sure that ending had a real chance of working. And despite all that pressure, Lucky Dog kept growing. The show became a major hit. Brandon won Daytime Emmy Awards, his books became popular, and he became one of the best-known dog trainers on television. In fact, he had managed to turn something that was deeply personal to him into a platform that reached millions of people. Every week, viewers watched him take dogs that had been overlooked or given up on and give them another chance. For a while, it looked like the perfect situation. Brandon was doing what he loved. Dogs were being rescued, families were being helped, and the show was doing extremely well. However, success has a way of changing things. As Lucky Dog became more popular, it also became much bigger than the small operation Brandon had started with. There were now advertisers, sponsors, network executives, producers, and other business interests involved. More people had opinions about what happened on the ranch and how the show should look on television. And that was where things slowly started getting complicated. You see, Brandon had spent his entire life learning to put the animal first. When he was working with a difficult dog, the question was simple: is the dog ready, and is this safe? Television had a different set of questions. How long would the scene take? Was the episode ready? Would viewers enjoy it? Would the sponsors be happy? Could everything stay on schedule? Of course, those differences didn't cause major problems right away. Brandon and the television team managed to work together for years, and from the outside, everything seemed fine. But as the show became bigger, the two sides began looking at it differently. Brandon was still focused on the dogs and the families, while the television side also had to think about schedules, sponsors, viewers, and the business behind the show. Slowly, that difference began creating tension. What had started as one man, his ranch, and a group of difficult dogs had grown into a major television business, and Brandon was still trying to do things the way he had always done them.
How did I get involved with pairing rescue dogs with disabled veterans? I was training animals for film and television. I did that for about 15 years.
Meanwhile, there were now far more people involved and far more expectations to deal with. For a while, he managed to keep everything together. But eventually, the growing pressure would force him to make a decision that nobody watching the show could have expected. The corporate takeover and the final straw. For years, Brandon managed to keep Lucky Dog moving despite the growing demands of television. The show was successful, the audience was growing, and from the outside, everything still looked fine. But behind the scenes, the bigger the show became, the more complicated things were getting. By the time Season 8 of Lucky Dog went into production in 2020, the ranch was no longer the same place Brandon had started with years earlier. What began in 2013 as a relatively small operation built around Brandon, a few crew members, and the goal of helping shelter dogs had grown into a much bigger television business. There were now sponsors, producers, network executives, and marketing teams involved. And with more money came more opinions. Brandon was still the person standing in front of the cameras training the dogs, but more and more people behind those cameras had something to say about how the work should be done. And this is where the real tension started. Brandon had spent his whole life learning how to read animals, understand their behavior, and know when to move forward or when to give them space. However, some of the people making decisions around the show did not have that kind of experience. They were looking at the production from a television point of view, asking what would keep viewers interested, what would work for sponsors, and what would help the show stay on schedule. Brandon, meanwhile, was looking at the same situation and thinking about the dog in front of him. Both sides wanted Lucky Dog to succeed, but they were starting to have very different ideas about what that success should look like. One of the biggest disagreements involved sponsors. As Lucky Dog became more popular, companies naturally wanted their products to appear on the show, and producers wanted Brandon to include some of those products during his training sessions. That could mean talking about certain dog foods, treats, or other pet products while he was working with the animals. Now, product placement is nothing unusual in television, but Brandon was not comfortable with the idea of turning serious training sessions into advertising opportunities. If a frightened shelter dog was struggling to trust people, the last thing Brandon wanted was to stop and make the moment feel like a commercial. However, the disagreements went beyond advertising. Brandon also became uncomfortable with how some of the emotional moments were being handled. A big part of Lucky Dog was the connection between the rescued dogs and the families who eventually adopted them, especially families going through difficult situations. Those moments were powerful because they felt real. But according to Brandon's own account, there was increasing pressure to make some scenes more dramatic for television. A reaction might need another take. A family reveal might be filmed again from a different angle, or a dog's behavior might be presented in a way that created more suspense before a commercial break. To Brandon, that was taking the show in the wrong direction. The emotional moments worked because they were genuine, and once you start trying too hard to create a reaction, you risk losing the very thing that made viewers care. He had spent years building trust with animals, and now he felt that the television side of the business was beginning to treat real moments like scenes that could simply be adjusted until they looked better on screen. But there was one issue that mattered even more to Brandon, and that was the dogs themselves. Television production runs on schedules. Dogs do not. A frightened animal does not suddenly become comfortable because the cameras are ready, and a dog with serious behavior problems cannot be forced through training simply because the next scene is waiting. Brandon understood that better than almost anyone, which made the growing pressure to keep production moving especially difficult for him. Mind you, this was not just about Brandon wanting to take his time. Rushing a troubled dog could create real problems. A dog that had spent years being frightened, neglected, or mistreated could easily react badly if pushed too quickly. Someone could get bitten, a crew member could get hurt, and the dog could end up being blamed for something that happened because it was simply not ready. Worse still, the animal Brandon was trying to save could end up right back in the shelter system with even fewer chances of finding a home. So the disagreements continued. Brandon pushed back during meetings, producers pushed back on him, and the distance between the two sides kept growing. The strange thing was that Lucky Dog was doing well. The show was successful, the audience was there, and the business was making money. But behind the scenes, Brandon felt that the original purpose of the show was slowly getting buried underneath everything else. As he later explained, there were simply too many people involved in decisions that once belonged to a much smaller group. What had started as a straightforward mission to help dogs had become a much larger production, and Brandon was finding it harder to protect the way he believed the work should be done. Then came 2020, and Brandon reached a point where he had to make a choice. He could stay with a successful show that had given him national fame, or he could walk away because he no longer agreed with the direction it was taking. Of course, leaving was not an easy decision. This was not some small project he could simply forget about. Lucky Dog had become a huge part of his life, and he had spent years building it. But in October 2020, Brandon finally explained what was happening. He posted a photo of himself with Apollo, the same dog he had been working with when television producers first discovered him, and opened up about his decision to leave. He explained that as more money came into the show, more people became involved in making decisions, and the project had started moving away from what it was originally meant to be. In his view, once the fun and the purpose were taken out of the work, there was no point pretending everything was still the same. For viewers, this post finally explained why Brandon had suddenly disappeared from Lucky Dog. He wasn't simply saying that he was tired of television, and he wasn't presenting his exit as just another career move. He was making it clear that the show had changed in a way he could no longer accept. For Brandon, the animals and the honesty behind the work mattered more than staying on a successful television show. However, Brandon had already made up his mind. He left Lucky Dog behind, and suddenly, the network had a problem it could not ignore. How do you keep a show going when the person who made it what it was has just walked away? The fallout and the vindication. When Brandon left Lucky Dog in 2020, the network had to figure out what to do next. They still had the dogs, the ranch, the families, and the show itself, so they brought in new hosts, Eric and Rochelle Vance, and continued with the series.
Then, another human, Rashi.
CBS's show Lucky Dog, which is in its 8th season now. The animal training couple joins us live this morning.
However, there was one thing they could not replace that easily: the connection Brandon had built with the audience over 7 years. Viewers noticed the change almost immediately. They had watched Brandon for years, so seeing someone else take over felt strange. The dogs were still being rescued, trained, and matched with families, but the show no longer felt quite the same. Brandon had become such a familiar part of Saturday mornings that his absence was impossible to ignore, and fans quickly made that clear. Soon, questions started appearing across the show's social media pages. Where was Brandon? Why did he leave? And why did the network change the show? Some viewers simply had no interest in watching the new version. They wanted the man they had followed for years, and this reaction showed just how important Brandon had become to Lucky Dog. People were not only watching to see whether a dog would find a home, they trusted Brandon to handle animals that many other people had given up on. That kind of connection takes years to build, so a new host could not simply step in and create the same relationship with viewers overnight. Meanwhile, Brandon was busy doing something very different. He went back to focusing on dogs without having to work around a television schedule, while continuing to teach people about training and share what he had learned from years of working with animals. He also wrote The Story of Dog, a book that explored the long relationship between humans and dogs and gave readers more insight into the way he understood them. His work with service dogs continued too. Through the Argus Service Dog Foundation, Brandon remained involved in training dogs to help people who needed them, including military veterans. This kind of training could take months, and that mattered because there was no camera crew waiting for a happy ending. Brandon could take the time needed to make sure the dog was actually ready before moving on. In fact, leaving Lucky Dog also allowed him to continue working with animals far beyond dogs. During Shark Week, he appeared in Great White Serial Killer, where he worked around great white sharks. It was another reminder that Brandon had never been an ordinary dog trainer. His entire life had been built around understanding animals, including the ones most people would never dream of approaching. However, the biggest change was that Brandon was now working without television, deciding when a story had to end. If a dog needed more time, he could give it more time. And if training took longer than expected, there was no episode deadline forcing him to rush. He could focus on the animal instead of worrying about what needed to happen before the next commercial break. And while Brandon was moving forward, people were still talking about him. Fans had not forgotten the original Lucky Dog, and many still wondered what had happened to the families and dogs from those early seasons. What happened after the cameras stopped filming? Did the dogs stay with their families? Did the training actually last? Those were questions the original show rarely had time to answer. But years later, Brandon would have the chance to do exactly that. This opportunity came when Brandon returned to the franchise with Lucky Dog Reunions. This time, viewers got something they had never really seen before. Instead of simply rescuing another dog and moving on to the next episode, Brandon could go back and see the people and animals whose lives he had already touched. He could finally find out what happened after the happy ending viewers had seen on television. And this made the return surprisingly emotional. A dog that had once been frightened or difficult to handle could now be seen years later, older and comfortable with the family Brandon had helped choose. The story had not ended when the credits rolled. The real story had continued long after the cameras left. This was what made Brandon's return so meaningful. He had walked away because he felt the work was moving too far away from what mattered to him. Years later, he came back and focused on something that had always been important, showing what happened to those dogs and families after television moved on. And this question lingers. If you had spent years building something that successful, but you felt it was no longer true to what you started it for, would you protect what you built at any cost? Or would you be willing to walk away? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you find this breakdown eye-opening, make sure to hit that like button, share it with another dog lover, and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into TV's biggest secrets.